Hi, this is Bernie Steffen, and I'm doing my premiere show today called Ecologic. I'm excited to be doing this show where we talk about honest, no bull conversations about the world we've built and what we're leaving behind. I'm delighted to welcome my very special guest. His name is Max Wilbert. He's a community organizer, a wilderness guide, and the co-founder of the anti-mining group called Protect Thacker Pass. He holds a master's degree in degrowth and currently works for the Community Environmental Defense Fund. He's also the co-author of Bright Green Lies, How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way and What We Can Do About It. And he publishes a newsletter called Biocentric. Welcome, Max.
I'm glad to be with you for the inaugural trip. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You're a very special guy, and I'm delighted you're my first guest here. And today our topic is the failure of scientific imagination. This is something you've written about and talked about. I look forward to chatting with you, and we won't run out of things to say. When we talk about scientific information, just the word science as we use it in our society, it carries a lot of weight, but it's misused a lot. I find that it's sometimes conflated with technology. Do you want to speak on that a little bit?
Sure. The reason is because the history of the development of science coming out of the Enlightenment is wrapped up in the history of empire, which has gone hand in hand with technological development, or what we could call technological escalation. Whether you're looking at Renaissance-era scientists, people like Leonardo da Vinci, who were researching human bodies and geometry and unlocking some of these fundamentals of human knowledge, at the same time they were on the payroll of various nobles and wealthy people in that era, the city-states of what's now Italy, to build weapons, to facilitate warfare in various ways. And that process accelerated during the Enlightenment. We're looking at people like Francis Bacon and the rise of the Royal Society in Britain. That was wrapped up in the colonialism that was happening at that time, that the British Empire was really spreading around the world to become the largest empire in history. Their scientific process was very much part of that, and they were deeply ensconced with each other. One example of this that people don't think of, botanists, people who we think of as loving the natural world and so on. Early botanists were largely working for the British Empire to figure out what type of plants in these different colonial properties owned by Britain could be monetized, turned into new cash crops, new export crops, could be turned into weapons and different forms of medicines, commercially useful things that would financially power the empire and would also empower further growth. So that really continues up until the modern day, where today, and often these places have direct links to the military-industrial complex, links between the Defense Advanced Research Projects like the DARPA, and many of the technologies that we use every day today, the internet, touchscreens, all of these things came out of military research, or at the very least, research that was jointly being done between corporate commercial scientists and with funding and support from the government and the military.
That is very interesting. I appreciate you giving us a little context. One form of science that we first learned, it's like math. It's a neutral term. It's a process to develop evidence and make decisions based on reality. I've used the shorthand, that's small s science. And the modern science that gets conflated with our technology, with a capital S science or dollar science, that's what gets funded and promoted as you've got to listen to this science. Say we all need to go back to thinking about science more. We can all use it as a tool much as we use math. It's not about the results as much as the process of learning what the real world is about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right about that. And that's where we see science has also been wrapped up in racism, because the colonial project was ideologically fueled by these racist understandings of the world, early racism was supported by scientific racism, which looked at differences in how people look and mapped them onto intelligence, onto ability to build complex civilizations, and so on. Science was put to use in the service of racism, and it's reflected back in many ways today. Communities who are progressively minded are starting to understand that what we might call traditional ecological knowledge is a form of highly complex science. It is based on observing cycles in the natural world, coming to various theories and hypotheses about why those things might be, testing those over time, observing changes in response to different variables, and then changing behavior based on that. When you think about Polynesians navigating across the entire Pacific Ocean without compasses, without GPS, by using the stars and currents in the ocean and various forms of dead reckoning, that's an incredibly complex, difficult thing to do, and then hit an island that's a few miles across in the biggest ocean on the world. It takes a level of sophistication in thinking, deduction, and reasoning that most people today could never manage.
As you're talking about that example, I know that a lot of folks are now contrasting sort of our modern society's science with traditional ecological knowledge. This is what you're talking about as indigenous peoples has developed understanding of the natural world and what is happening. It's their science, but they don't use the word science. I hate the use of the word science being corrupted. The scientific process is an honorable thing that we don't want to lose. What we don't want to do is be misguided by what people who are being paid in their scientific research to find as, well, this is natural because it's science. It's coming out of science.
A lot of people think that science is neutral. Right? A lot of people think that technology is neutral. I disagree with that. I think that's a very dangerous thing. I think science and technology have inherent value to them. They lead down certain paths and foreclose other paths. For example, splitting the atom led to the development of nuclear weapons. It led to the Cold War. It led to uranium on the Navajo reservation, still poisoning people today, 75 years later. It led to the bombing of Nagasaki, the bombings of Bikini Atoll, and these different places where nuclear weapons have been tested, many of which are still contaminated today. It led to all these different things, right? And of course, we can say it also led to nuclear medicine. It led to X-rays, the variety of tools that are used for health and people's well-being. Technologies have inherent qualities, and this is especially true of a lot of modern technologies that are very dependent on mining, on fossil fuels, on high energy systems of various sorts. These things both require and reinforce certain pathways of social development. And we can't ignore that. We can't just say science is neutral, it's what we do with it.
I wanted to add the idea that our human knowledge has grown exponentially for quite a while, such that today in the sciences, there's so many silos. There's thousands of PhDs working to advance one particular aspect of human knowledge. Most of us can't wrap our minds around it. We can't pull wisdom out of that complexity and all that is scientific results that is being advanced every single day. And I feel like that chasm is growing bigger and bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the pathways of development that's been unlocked by the trajectory of science and the accumulation of knowledge that we have been embarked upon in this culture, in this industrial civilization that we live in today. Extreme specialization of knowledge and it's a loss of wisdom. It is a loss of community. In a way, these things are linked. And I think that just one example of that, to return to the idea of power, nuclear energy technology, to develop these type of technologies, you don't just need a few people in the lab doing research. Thousands of researchers and postdoctorates and scientists doing all kinds of experiments. You need mining that provides them with the raw materials to conduct their experiments. You need factories that build the equipment that they need. We need supply chains to get everything. We need energy to run the equipment. You need places which are deemed sacrifice zones in which you can test and dispose of toxic aftermath of these experiments. And all of this is wrapped up in the process. We can't separate it out and say this is an entirely neutral thing.
I had an experience of talking to a scientist at Stanford who was studying single-cell life. And I said, how come there are so many intelligent people in the universities that can't seem to deal with the climate change issue? His point to me was there are climate scientists working on it. He believes that in the various silos, in aggregate, we will solve all these problems. The truth is that by going down all of these paths of more and more knowledge, we seem to get further and further away from dealing with root issues when it comes to why we are experiencing climate change now.
Yeah, there are a lot of scientists that I have a lot of respect for. I hope if there are scientists listening, if there are folks who see the value in science, they're not being turned off by this conversation, because there are a lot of scientists who are doing incredibly important, beautiful work and not falling into these traps that we've been talking about. Of course, we're making some generalizations. We're talking big picture here. One example of what you're talking about, that sort of siloing of the thinking, is I had an opportunity back in 2010 to go to Russia. At the time, Russia and the U.S. had much better relationships. To go to Russia as part of a climate science expedition that was funded by the National Science Foundation. There were a bunch of professors, postdocs, and PhD students, and there were also master's students and undergrad. It was a big expedition. There were probably about 40 of us. We went to this very remote area in northeastern Siberia along the lower Kolyma River. Very difficult to get there. And we stayed in this science station that has been in place for something like 20, 30 years, where a few Russian scientists and their families have been studying global warming, following permafrost, carbon cycles in these Arctic tundra landscapes up there, studying methane release from permafrost. And so I was there. I'm not a scientist, but I've always been a science communicator, you might say, somebody who really sees value in having scientific literacy, in figuring out ways to communicate that to the general public, especially ecological sciences and what they teach us about the crisis we're facing today. The scientists are going out every day and they're measuring permafrost thaw, and they're capturing methane bubbling out of these lakes, and they're sampling algae blooms and doing all this research to measure what's going on. And afterwards, we go back to our bunkhouse, which is in this old barge floating on the side of a small tributary, and we're just hanging out and eating our food, talking, relaxing. And one of the things that I was struck by in this whole experience was exactly what you're talking about, Bernie. The extent to which these scientists, many of whom were literally among the top experts in the world on global warming in the Arctic, how little they actually wanted to talk about the politics of it and changing it. It seemed like the general perspective among most of them was that's for politicians to deal with and society to deal with. Our job is to do the science and provide the best quality information possible so that society can make rational decisions based on that information.
My guest, whom you're listening to, is Max Wilbert. And Max is quite fluent in this subject. He's written a lot. And what I really like about you, Max, is tie all of our issues back to our civilization, what we're doing to other species, and what we're doing to the lands and property of indigenous people, that we are destroying, bringing in more and more technology to fight climate change, and in doing so, we're actually making the problem worse. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. This is, I think, one of the consequences of the scientific approach to solving cultural problems. I don't think the global warming crisis is primarily a technological problem. I don't think it's primarily an engineering problem. And in that, I disagree with people like Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil and Secretary of Energy under Trump's first term. He said global warming is an engineering problem. That was his approach. He acknowledged that global warming was happening, But I said it's an engineering problem. And what do you do with engineering problems? You apply technology. You build things. You change the way you're doing things in a technical way to address the problem. I don't think that's what global warming is. I think it's something much different than that. In fact, I think it's a symptom of a broken relationship with the planet. I think it's a symptom of a fundamentally flawed approach of looking at the natural world as resources, as a place to extract from, as a place to dump pollution, and as something to the methods of science in many cases, as well as management techniques borrowed from the business world image in order to deal with problems.
I was starting out as a climate activist in 2010 and doing a talk show on KWMR. I was in line with people like Bill McKibben with 350.org, and I was definitely pulled into the green revolution. But I quickly learned that wasn't taking us in the right direction. We were missing the bigger picture that you're talking about, and that's why I'm so excited having you as a guest on the show today. You made that connection in much of what you've written in the past, like your authorship of Bright Green Lies. I use that term as a result of you having, and people like Ozzie Zenner, that have seen through the fact that it's not just a climate change problem. Climate change is a symptom, and aiming at reducing the carbon in the atmosphere misses the other aspects of the destruction that our civilization is doing to the natural world and our future.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that solar panels and wind turbines and electric cars were going to save the world for quite a while. I started studying global warming when I was young in the early 2000s, just reading about it. It wasn't being covered much. There certainly was almost nothing in the newspaper. I really thought that those technologies were going to be a big contributor to saving us. And luckily, I think I've been schooled in not just a critique of global warming as a problem, but also an understanding that capitalism is one of the major drivers of our ecological crisis. There's a relationship between the exploitation of workers, the destruction of the planet, the destruction of indigenous people's land, left of their lands, and the climate issue that we're facing. And I was just lucky to be exposed to those type of politics when I was young. So I never fully bought into those technologies. I believed in them. I thought they were important, but I saw them as one part of a comprehensive social transformation that was needed in order to address global warming. What we're seeing today from many proponents of using technologies to solve global warming is essentially, let's maintain business as usual, industrial capitalism, the U.S. as an empire dominating the rest of the world militarily and through various predatory trade practices. Let's just power it with fossil fuel or with wind and geothermal and so on. It's a Freudian slip because, of course, Biden pumped far more oil than Trump did under Trump's first administration, at least. Biden continued this all-of-the-above energy strategy, which was let's bring on these other sources of energy as well. The problem with that is as soon as we concede that industrial capitalism is going to continue in more or less the form it has, that means we're conceding the ongoing colonization and destruction of indigenous lands. We're conceding the ongoing sixth mass extinction of life on Earth. We're conceding more and more plastics and dioxins and other toxic substances contaminating our world. We're conceding an increasingly dystopian ecological future, but for one in which we're lowering carbon emissions to some extent.
I feel passionate about this too, and I want to add some ideas that you're bringing up that are so important. It's also our political structures, like the notion that Biden could do anything else because in our system you get elected based on economics, and we are trying to govern hundreds of millions of people by one set of rules and one set of priorities. And so I've come to the belief that what I used to learn was think global, act local. But I've come to now believe that we need to start thinking local and acting local, because thinking globally and looking to global solutions or even national solutions won't get us anywhere. I believe very strongly, and this is what motivates me to do this show, is that we really all need to look to where we live in the watershed, in the ecosystem, with the other species that we're connected to, and the people that live here, not the virtual people we meet over social media. It's really local that fuels me.
I think you're right to some extent. The problems that we're dealing with are global in scale, and there's certainly value in understanding the United States in geopolitics and how that plays into the ecological crisis. What's happening in Venezuela, for example, the foreign intervention in Venezuela is linked to trying to destabilize Cuba and China, geopolitical rivals of the United States, in order to increase the power of this country. But in terms of how do we approach these issues, how do we solve these issues, I wish that there was a silver bullet that I could present to people. We've all been working on how to solve these crises for a long time. Longer than I've been alive, people have been working on this. And we haven't been able to come to a positive outcome. There are many reasons for that, but I always just try to remember the fact of power in all this. In my view, the destruction of the planet is not a mistake. It's not a misunderstanding. It's not an accident. It's happening because certain forces, certain people, certain institutions in society are deliberately choosing to do so in order to increase their own wealth and power.
And to name that group, I call that, and I think you call that, industrial civilization, as opposed to other cultures which are indigenous. None of the indigenous cultures are destroying the planet or are responsible for climate change. I hate it when people say climate change is human caused. No, it's not our species. It's one organization that used to be called Western civilization that has now dominated the global culture and is a global industrial civilization.
And the thing is, Bernie, I am living in the United States. I'm looking out across the place where I live, which is Eugene, Oregon. I'm looking out across the city right now. And we're all dependent upon the system. Right? My food comes from the grocery store for the most part. Since learning about the ecological crisis, I've worked increasingly to become more self-sufficient, to get my food locally, to do all these kinds of things. Nonetheless, I'm dependent on the system. And most of us are. And I think a lot of people see that, and they think about the things that they enjoy that come from industrial civilization, whether it's TV shows or ice cream or hot showers or modern medicine. Things that we enjoy or are dependent on that come from the society, and they say we can't challenge industrial civilization, we can't challenge industrial modernity, because then what would we have? I think about this in a different way. I think that rather than adopting this way of life because it's the best way to live, most of the people that have adopted this way of life have done so because they had no other choice. There's a term for this that I learned a number of years ago called forced proletarianization. Using the term proletarian as in worker, wage worker, and forced proletarianization. Demonization is a process whereby people who used to be self-sufficient, who used to grow their own food in their community, support themselves from the land around them, and rely on themselves along with maybe some trading with their neighbors. And those people being forced into a situation where they could no longer do that. In order to survive, they had to work for somebody else. They had to go into the economy. They had to get health care from the system. They had to get their housing from the system. Because the land had been privatized. It belonged to somebody else. You need to pay them in order to have a place to live. You need to pay somebody else for food because you don't have land to grow it on. You don't have land where you can go hunt and gather. Maybe the food is poisoned. Or maybe you can't get there because you don't have transportation. Maybe there just isn't enough of it because the population has grown so much. It's difficult for us in our modern way of thinking to even get our minds wrapped around it because we've been colonized for so long. My friends who are native have done a lot of work in the Great Basin. I was just working with my friend Sherry writing about Thacker Pass. She's Paiute, and She was talking about how the mines and the industrial projects in her area are destroying more of the traditional hunting grounds, more of the places where they gather food medicine plants. So her people were only colonized 150 years ago. They remember the old ways.
Yep.
They remember not that it was a utopia, everything was perfect, everyone was happy, but that they were free. They had freedom. They had autonomy. They had their land. They had their community. And then that was stolen by the United States through a process of settler colonialism. That happened to my ancestors, too, in Europe. It was just thousands of years ago. And a lot of my work is aimed towards how do we fight and dismantle this industrial civilization while simultaneously building and returning to more time-tested, low-energy, local ways of living in relationship with the land where we live. Because that's the only sustainable societies that have ever existed lived in that way. And the whole idea that we can live in technological modernity and make it sustainable is at best a theory, and I would call it a crackpot theory, because the evidence does not support that.
I love what you're saying, Max, and I like that you're connected not only to the wilderness and wanting to protect the other species and the ecosystems that still are functioning, and connected to indigenous people. So I met you out at Thacker Pass, which is a lithium mine that you and Will Falk partnered on to fight and put up a good stand. But in the end, you wound up getting arrested, and it seems like the water rights are being sold from a rancher to do that lithium. Do you want to expand on that catastrophe a little bit?
I've been part of the radical environmental movement for more than 15 years. Been involved in a lot of campaigns of fighting fossil fuels. Tar sands in Utah, coal trains and oil train transportation to Washington State and Oregon, coal export terminals, all kinds of fossil fuel projects, pipelines. I've also been involved in fighting logging and so on. But in 2020, I learned about this mining project called Thacker Pass, a lithium mine. It was planned for a place in northern Nevada near the Oregon border. I went down to the site to see what it was like because I'm somebody who loves wild places. I've learned over the years that when you're fighting the destruction of the natural world, it's important to be there, to be in person in these places which are threatened, to take action at those places. It's not just important for strategic reasons, but also for moral and spiritual reasons to be in these places. I went down there and fell in love with that place. I made phone calls and talked to people throughout the environmental movement. It became clear pretty quickly that almost nobody was going to fight for this place. Nobody was going to fight this mine. At the time, it seemed maybe one local rancher was going to file a lawsuit because he was worried about his water being impacted by the project. It seemed like some small environmental groups were going to contest the permit for the mine. But it just seemed like one of those projects that was likely to fly under the radar and get built in a very rural, remote area, a place where it's easy to sneak something past people. I decided it was important to fight for that place, not just because it's ecologically important. We're talking about a place where sage-grouse live, bobcats, mountain lions, antelope, deer, rattlesnake, Pacific tree frogs, lizards, pygmy rabbit, burrowing owls, and thousands of other creatures. But also for the reason that it's a lithium mine, and lithium is one of the main ingredients in electric car batteries, energy storage batteries. So I decided we needed to fight this mine because it was symbolic of what a lot of people see as a solution to global warming and the ecological crisis. Because it represented this new frontier of ecological destruction, which isn't really new, was green extractivism, extracting raw materials for the so-called green economy, where the extraction is being done in the exact same ways, exact same wind pollution and habitat destruction. And so I decided that we need to fight this because if we don't, then this idea that the green energy transition is this symbol understood. As we went out there in January 2021, we set up a protest camp. We ended up in Thacker Pass, camping out on the side of the mountain about a mile above sea level from January 15th, 2021, until November of that year. At that point, the federal government started trying to fine me and my friend Will Falk about $50,000 and called it illegal occupation development of public lands because we built a pit toilet latrine for native elders. We started connecting with native folks from the area, and it became clear that this is a sacred site. It was very culturally significant to the indigenous people from that area, mainly Northern Paiutes and other people as well. They only learned about that from us when we went out there and started protesting it, because the permitting for the project was rushed through. It was all done during the pandemic. It was fast-tracked under the Trump administration. A process that would usually take 4 or 5 years and would involve long public comment periods and education for the community and letting people know about how the project was going to be. That never happened. And so the tribes largely didn't even know that the mine was coming until we started getting in the news for being out there protesting. We figure out it's a sacred site, the protest movement grows, and we ended up working with several tribes from around the area to file federal lawsuits against the project. There's more protest camps that get established. We go out there and take direct action in 2023 and block construction. But in the end, the mining company sues us. There's various forms of state repression that we're dealing with, and the mine is being built as we speak. So the sacred site's being bulldozed, all that habitat, thousands and thousands of acres, about 17,000 acres, 18,000 actually, are being destroyed, and billions of gallons of water being pumped out of the aquifer to support this mine. All of this is moving forward despite huge amounts of opposition from the communities in the area. It is a huge fight. Mining is heavily protected under U.S. law, with some laws going back to the 1860s that prioritize mining on public lands. It's an uphill battle to stop a mine like this, at least when you're working within the boundaries of the law. I really think that the only way that these type of mining projects are ever going to be stopped on a serious basis is if we don't fight project by project, and instead we're working to bring down the entire edifice of industrial capitalism, industrial modernity. That whole thing needs to fall. Because as long as that sort of machine continues growing, building, expanding, discovering new technologies, building new things, they're going to need more and more mining. They're going to need to destroy more places for raw materials to support that. And that's where I think we need systemic thinking. Part of our goal with the campaign wasn't stop and protect that place, which we weren't able to do. But part of our goal was to question the entire logic behind the project. In that sense, I think we were somewhat successful. I think we helped shift the conversation around lithium mining specifically, but more broadly green technology in general. We were on the front page of the New York Times, Le Monde, on NPR, and of course all the alternative movement media spaces as well, trying to spread this message, not just that this one project is bad, but that this entire trajectory of development that green technology represents is a false solution to the problem that we're facing. We need to go much deeper and get to the roots of the ecological crisis if we want to have a chance in hell of stopping it.
I hope people are wanting to hear more of this, because I'm excited about doing this kind of talk show radio and getting guests at a local level to really explore how in Sonoma County we can live less destructively, with less energy, and more in touch with wilderness. We have a lot of folks who appreciate the natural beauty. They come to hike through the redwoods and along the coast and have a great appreciation for what's here. So thank you again, Max. I really appreciate it.